In our post-democratic and post-political times, how can we envisage for cultural and artistic practices the possibility of challenging neoliberalism? This is the question that I'm going to examine. Some argue that artists and cultural workers cannot play anymore a critical role in our societies because they have become a necessary part of capitalist production. The production of symbol is now a central goal of capitalism, and through the development of the creative industries, individuals have become totally subjugated to the control of capital. Cultural producers have been transformed in passive function of the capitalist system. They are, in fact, prisoners of the culture industry, dominated by the media and the entertainment corporation. Among those who disagree with such a view, there is, in fact, no consensus when it comes to visualize the type of resistance to which artistic practices could make a decisive contribution, and particularly the form that those resistances should take. So we've got these two views. Some people say, no point, no place for resistances. Some people say, yeah, there are some places, but they disagree about, what can be done. And this is what I want to examine. One of the main disagreements, but here it's a disagreement among the people who believe that it's possible, to still play a role. So one of the main disagreements among them concern the spaces in which resistances should be deployed and the type of relation to be established with artistic institutions. The question of institution is very important, and I'm going to speak about that at the end. Should critical artistic practices engage with museums and other similar institutions with the aim of transforming them, or should they desert them altogether? One position advocates what can be called a strategy of withdrawal from institution. It claims that under pause for this condition, artists working inside existing institutions are totally instrumentalized and that they are bound to contribute to the reproduction of the capitalist system. Resistances are still possible, however, but people who defend this position argue that they can only be located outside the institution of the art world, which have, according to them, become complicit with capitalism, and for that reason cannot provide anymore a site for critical artistic practices. Those who defend such a view, that it's possible to have resistances, but only outside the cultural institution, they advocate a conception of radical politics conceived as auto-organization of the multitude and formulated in terms of an exodus. This strategy of exodus comes in different versions, depending on how the future of the multitude is envisaged, but they all assert that the traditional structure of power organized around the national state and representative democracy have become irrelevant, and that they will progressively disappear. For that reason, any collaboration with the traditional channels of politics, like parties or trade unions, are to be avoided. The multitude should ignore the existing power structure and concentrate its effort in constructing alternative social forms outside public institutions and outside the state power network. Well, I'm sure that here in Italy you will recognize who speak about that, because many of the people who defend that view are in fact Italian thinkers. In one of my recent books, not the last one but the one previous, Agonistic, I have taken issue with this conception of radical politics, the political politics in the Exodus, and argued in favor of a different strategy that I call a strategy of involvement with the institution. This strategy is informed by a theoretical approach developed in a book that we wrote, Ernesto Laclau and I, that was published in 1985, of course, Hegemony and Socialist Strategy Towards a Radical Democratic Politics. This approach that we developed in that book have two key concepts, antagonism and hegemony. And it asserts that addressing the question of the political requires acknowledging, on one side, the ever-present possibility of antagonism, and also coming to terms with the lack of a final ground and the undecidability that pervades every order. This signifies recognizing the hegemonic nature of every kind of social order and envisaging society as the product of a series of practices that always attempt at establishing an order, but always in a context of contingency. And so always, that order is always precarious. There is always the possibility of subverting this order. Every order is therefore seen as the temporary and precarious articulation of contingent hegemonic practices. This means that things could always have been otherwise, and that every order is predicated on the exclusion of other possibilities. What is at a given moment considered as the natural order is always the result of sedimented hegemonic practices. That is, it's never the manifestation of a deeper objectivity that will be exterior to the practice that brings it into being. Every hegemonic order is therefore always susceptible of being challenged by counter-hegemonic practices. That is, practices which will attempt to disarticulate the existing order so as to install another form of hegemony. I think that's important as a background to the kind of point I'm going to make about artistic practices, because if you don't start with a view of society that can be transformed, articulated, then it's no point in even trying to think how you can intervene. I think that such an approach permits us to grasp the complexity of the forces at play in the emergence of the current neoliberal hegemony, thereby also allowing us to understand how to develop a counter-hegemonic offensive. It shows how this hegemony, the existing hegemony, neoliberal hegemony, is the result of a set of political intervention in a complex field of economic, legal, and ideological forces. It is a discursive construction that articulates in a very specific manner a manifold of practices, discourse, and language games of a very different nature. Through a process that we call of sedimentation, the political origin of those contingent practices has been erased, and those practices have become, so to speak, naturalized. Neoliberal practices and institutions can therefore appear as the outcome of natural processes, and the form of identification that they have produced are crystallized in identities that are taken for granted. The fact that the recognition of the constructed nature of those identities is something that cannot be acknowledged. And of course, this is how the view of the world, which provides the framework for what most people currently perceive as possible, what is desirable, it's been established. To challenge neoliberalism, it is therefore vital to transform this framework, and this is precisely what an hegemonic struggle should be about, to disarticulate the existing practices, to show that other things are possible and bring them to the fore. By bringing to the fore the discursive nature of the social and the multiplicity of discursive practices through which our world is constructed, this hegemonic approach that we've developed with Ernesto Laclau is particularly fruitful, I think, when it comes to apprehending the relation between art and politics. And this is what I want to talk about here. It highlights the fact that the construction of an hegemony is not limited to the traditional political institution, but that it also takes place in the multiplicity of spaces of what is usually called civil society. There is where, as Antonio Gramsci has shown, a particular conception of the world is established and a specific understanding of reality is defined. But, of course, this is what Gramsci refers to the common sense, which provides the terrain in which specific forms of subjectivity are constructed. I think that such an approach is important because it reveals that artistic practices constitute an important terrain for the construction of political identities, and that they contribute to the emergence of new forms of subjectivity. And this approach also allows us to grasp the decisive role that those practices, cultural and artistic practices, could play in the counter-hegemonic struggle. What is at stake in this counter-hegemonic struggle is indeed the transformation of the common sense understood as the space where specific forms of subjectivity are constructed. And so this, I think, is crucial to understanding the role of artistic practices. Here I want to clarify that, and I think it's quite important, this clarification. The hegemonic approach does not envisage the relation between art and politics. This is what I want to examine here. It does not envisage it in terms of two separately constituted fields. We had art on one side and politics on the other, between which a relation will have to be established. As I have, in fact, repeatedly emphasized in my work, so you probably, several of you will have heard that quite a few times already, but I think that for me is crucial. There is an aesthetic dimension in the political, and there is a political dimension in art. Indeed, from the point of view of the theory of hegemony, artistic practices play a role in the constitution and the maintenance of a given symbolic order, or in its challenging. Either reproduce the symbolic order, its maintenance, or in its challenging. And this is why they necessarily have a political dimension. The political, for its part, concerns the symbolic ordering of social relations, and this is where its aesthetic dimension resides. And this is why, that's also something that I have often argued, it's not appropriate to make a distinction between art and political art. So to say, there is art which is political and there is, no. Because, in fact, that implies that there supposedly will be an art which is not political. So I don't like this distinction, political art. And this is why I have proposed to refer to critical art. Instead of speaking of political art, critical art. So every form of art has got a political dimension, but some have got a dimension which is a critical one, and that's what is usually referred as political art. Critical artistic practices, no, the one who are usually considered as political, are those which in a variety of ways contribute to the unsettling of the dominant hegemony and play a part in the process of disarticulation, rearticulation that characterize the counter-hegemonic politics. This counter-hegemonic politics aims at targeting the institution which secure the dominant hegemony so as to bring about a profound transformation in the way they function. This strategy of, we can call it a war of position, using Gramsci's term, is composed of a diversity of practices and intervention, operating in a multiplicity of spaces, economic, legal, political, and cultural. In the present conjuncture, with neoliberal conjuncture, with the decisive role played by the culture industries in the capitalist process of reproduction, the cultural and artistic terrain has become of an ever greater strategic importance. That it always is important, but I think today is particularly important because artistic and cultural production is currently vital for capital valorization. This is due to the increasing reliance of post-Fordist capitalism on semiotic techniques in order to create the mode of subjectivation which are necessary for its reproduction. As Michel Foucault pointed out, in modern production, what he called the control of the soul is crucial in governing affects and passion because the form of exploitation characteristic of times in which manual labor was dominant has been replaced by new ones which constantly call for the creation of new needs and incessant desire for the acquisition of goods. That's, of course, the transformation of, some people call that from Fordim to post-Fordim. Others will speak, for instance, of biopolitical power. But there are different terms, which, of course, there is obviously a difference between, the time before the development of neoliberalism. To maintain its hegemony, the capitalist system today needs to permanently mobilize people's desire and shape their identities. And the cultural terrain, with its various institutions, occupies for that reason a key position in that process. And this is why the hegemonic perspective asserts that it's not by deserting the institutional terrain that critical artistic practices can contribute to the counter-hegemonic struggle, but by engaging with that institutional terrain, with the aim of fostering dissent. What is at stake in the struggle, the struggle to transform subjectivities, is the construction of a multiplicity of spaces that I've called agonistic spaces. So that is very much linked to the reflection that I developed about agonistic democracy. I think it's important to develop agonistic spaces where the dominant consensus can be subverted and where new modes of subjectification, of identification, are going to be made available. Since the fostering of agonistic public spaces constitute a key dimension in the counter-hegemonic struggle, I think it's important to explain that by agonistic public spaces, I mean public spaces where conflicting points of view are confronted without any possibility of final reconciliation. The aim is not to arrive at a final reconciliation. Therefore, such an agonistic view challenging the widespread conception of the public space, which is conceived the terrain where one should aim at creating consensus. It is therefore very different from, for instance, the conception defended by Jürgen Habermas, who present, emphatically, the public sphere as the place where deliberation aiming at a rational consensus should take place. To be sure, is to be fair to Habermas, he now accepts, that was not always the case, but he now accepts that it is improbable, given the limitation of social life, that such a consensus could effectively be reached. And this is why he sees this ideal situation of communication as a regulative ideas. However, from the perspective of the hegemonic approach, the impediment to the Habermasian ideal speech situation, and for him the impediments are that we will never be able completely to liberate ourselves from, specific particularities in order to identify with our rational self. So they are basically, for him, the obstacles are empirical. Well, according to the hegemonic approach, they are not empirical, they are ontological. Indeed, one of the main tenets of this hegemonic approach is that such a rational consensus is a conceptual impossibility, because it presupposes the availability of a consensus without exclusion. And this is precisely what the hegemonic approach reveals to be impossible. I've developed that in my work very much, and in fact, I think it has a lot of consequences for politics, and it's central of my current reflection. But of course, this is not the topic I want to develop here. But basically, the idea that there is always what we can call a constitutive outside to any form of consensus. I hope that by now I've said enough to make clear that those who foster the creation of agonistic public spaces visualize the role of artistic practices in a very different way than those whose objective is the creation of consensus. Critical art for those people who follow the agonistic approach is constituted by a manifold of artistic practices aiming at bringing to the fore the existence of alternatives to the current post-political order. Its critical dimension consists in making visible what the dominant consensus tend to obscure, to obliterate. What's at stake is giving a voice to those who are silenced within the framework of the existing neoliberal hegemony. Here, I would like to stress, because there's been kind of some misunderstanding about my position, that according to such a perspective, critical artistic practices do not try to lift a supposedly false consciousness so as to reveal the true reality, because this will be completely at odds with the anti-essentialist premise of the theory of hegemony. For this theory of hegemony, there is nothing that we call a true consciousness. So it's not a question of lifting the question of the ideology so that people will realize their false consciousness. That does not exist. I mean, of course, any form of subjectivity is always a discursive construction that's central to our approach. So it is always through insertion in a manifold of practices, discourse, and language game that specific form of individualities, identification are constructed. So the transformation of political identities can never be the result of a rationalist appeal to the true interest of the subject. It consists in the inscription of the social agent in practices that will mobilize its affect in a way that disarticulate the framework in which the dominant process of identification is taking place so as to bring about other form of identification. And I think that, for instance, to inscribe the social agent in different practices, and of course those practices can be different types, but I think that artistic practices are precisely type of practices that can create this transformation of subjectivities. This also means that to construct oppositional identities is not enough to simply foster a process of disidentification. A lot of people speak of a question of disidentification. Well, I think that this is not how one should see the struggle, because the second move is necessary to insist a process like of re-identification. To insist only on the first move is in fact to remain trapped in a problematic according to which the negative moment will be sufficient on its own to bring about something positive, as if new subjectivities were already available, ready to emerge when the weight of the dominant ideology will have been lifted. So it's in fact similar to what I was criticizing in terms of false consciousness. Such a view, which I must say, in my view, for many forms of critical art, fail to come to terms with the nature of the hegemonic struggle and the complex process of constitution of identities. I contend that for all those who want to intervene in the cultural and artistic domain in a counter-hegemonic way, of course, nobody is forced to do that, but if your aim is to intervene in the counter-hegemonic way, it's crucial to visualize artistic practices as an articulation of discursive and affective elements. Contrary to the rationalist approach, such a perspective indicates that it is not by reaching the understanding through concept that artistic practices are able to bring about a transformation of subjectivity. It is by their articulation with affects that ideas can gain a real force and crystallize in desire. It means that the impact of artistic practices should not be envisaged primarily at the cognitive level. I must say that I'm not a total Deleuzian, but there is a point on which I agree with Deleuze, and it is what he said in the book written by with Guattari, What is Philosophy, when he said that the production of the aim of art is to produce sensation, not concept. And I think I totally agree with that. I think the object of artistic practices is not the production of concept, but the production of sensation. And that the cognitive, conceptual dimension should not be privileged. Of course, this does not mean that there is no cognitive dimension in artistic practices, but that it is via the affective dimension that the cognitive level should be reached. This is why, if we want to visualize how artistic practices can contribute to the subversion of the dominant hegemony, it is fruitful to acknowledge their discursive affective character, conceiving them as providing affection able to modify subjective structure. Here, in fact, in my recent work, I've very much referred to Spinoza and his distinction between affectio, affectus, the affectio being the inscription, and the affection, and which produce desire, produce affect and desire and move people to act. For those who want to contribute to a radical politics of counter-hegemonic engagement with neoliberal institutions, one important task is, therefore, to cultivate a multiplicity of practices that will erode the common affects, sustaining the common affects, sustaining the current neoliberal hegemony. those practices should aim at fostering affect of a different nature, so creating form of affection, that practices that are going to really bring about other form of affects. Unfortunately, and you know, I really, this is really crucial, the importance of recognizing the affective dimension in the creation of political identities. And unfortunately, generally, left parties do not understand the importance of mobilizing passion in a democratic direction. Here, there's a whole vocabulary distinction. I've in my work, use the term passion. A lot of people say, why don't you call, speak of emotion, you know? And I say, no, it's not the same thing, you know, because I use passion for a very specific reason. I can't replace that by emotion. And in fact, passion for me refers to common affects. Common affects particularly, and that's related to my more recent work, which are a stake in the creation of a people, us, you know, because I think that us, the collective will, is always the crystallization of common affects. And I think that, you know, it's not a question of emotion, it's really something different. And of course, this is something that left parties do not understand. They believe that referring to affect is something that only the right, you know, does. And the left should only limit always itself to rational argument and deliberative procedure. And I think that this is why they are not able to answer the challenge posed by the rise of right-wing populism, whose success is linked to the fact that they do understand, certainly much better than the left, that politics is always partisan, and that it requires the creation of an us-them relation, and that, you know, the importance of mobilizing passion in this creation. They are aware of the importance of constructing collective political identities and of fostering the development of a collective will through the mobilization of affects. And this is, I think, what explains their growing success in many European countries, where they have managed to foster new form of collective identification around the notion of the people. But of course, people which is constructed in a particular special way, people that will curtail democracy, or in the name of recovering democracy, but this is obviously what is central to the appeal of those parties, but in fact is recovering democracy to really curtail it, to restrict it, while left-wing populism approach will also want to create a people, but constructed in a different way, and in order to recover the democracy, but to extend, to radicalize it. However, this is, I think, you know, something that is really difficult to enter in the head of the people on the left, because they think that the best way to fight against those parties is to denigrate them, because I do affect, to accuse them of being populist. So this really is for me, a real obstacle to understanding how one can fight against them. And of course, they condemn the appeal to affects by those parties and claim that democratic politics must be based exclusively on rational argument, and that is necessary to expel passion from politics. I'm really convinced that such a stance represents the main obstacle in the elaboration of a strategy to challenge our post-democratic condition. What's at stake in the construction of a progressive collective will, able to crystallize, you know, affect in a way which is aimed at the deepening of democracy. This is really what should be the center of our reflection today. Okay, so this is in general my reflection on this question. But since I'm speaking here in the context of a museum, I will want to add something, and this is going to be my last point. I'm going to ask how to visualize the role of museum and cultural institution within the framework that I've delineated here. Could they contribute to the agonistic struggle by undermining the imaginary environment of the consumer society? Of course, this is a view which, many people will say, no, it's not possible. But my view is that far from being seen as conservative institution, impervious to change and dedicated to the maintenance and reproduction of the existing hegemony, museum and art institutions could become agonistic public spaces where this hegemony is openly contested. To be sure, the history of the museum has been linked since the beginning to the construction of bourgeois hegemony. But this function can be altered. As Wittgenstein has taught us, signification is always dependent on context and of use. Use is what determines meaning. And I think that this is also true for institutions. We should therefore discard the essentialist idea that some institutions are by essence destined to fulfill one immutable function. In fact, we have already witnessed how, following the neoliberal trend, many museums have abandoned their original function of educating citizens in the dominant culture and have been reduced to site of entertainment for a public of consumers. The main objective of those so-called postmodern museums is to make money through blockbuster exhibition and to the sale of manifold of products for tourists. The type of participation, because of course they insist a lot on participation, they propose is based on consumerism, and that they are actively contributing to the commercialization and depoliticization of the cultural field. So this is what been a trend, serious trend under neoliberalism. But this neoliberal turn is not the only possible form of evolution. And from the hegemonic perspective, we could rethink the function of the museum in a different way, envisaging the possibility of transforming museum and cultural institutions into agonistic public space and of converting them into site of opposition to neoliberal hegemony. In fact, several experiences are already offering example of the strategy of engagement that I am advocating, but so, this strategy of engagement with institution, of course, here I want to say it's also important with artistic institution. One of the very early experience which I've been involved is the one developed by the MACBA, Museum de Arte Contemporáneo de Barcelona, who under the direction of Manuel Borgaviel. Borgaviel is not there anymore, he moved to the Reina Sofia in Madrid, but he's the one who really transformed the MACBA. He succeeded in creating a new model of museum. Between 2000 and 2008, for instance, various projects informed by critical pedagogy were launched to recover the educational role of the museum and its role as a constituent part of the public sphere. With the aim of proposing an alternative reading of modern art, the MACBA started to develop a collection and organize temporary exhibition privileging artists and art scene which had been neglected by the dominant discourse on artistic modernity. Another of its objectives was to establish a vibrant relation between the museum and the city, because the museum was constructed in the area of Barcelona, the Raval, which was really a very, very proletarian part of Barcelona. And of course, the idea was, gentrification, to have constructed this incredible museum by Richard Mayer there. But precisely, Borgaviel wanted to fight against that, wanted to bring people from the Raval into the museum. So he wanted to transform the MACBA into a space of debate for the expression of conflict. looking for ways in which art could make a significant contribution to a multiplication of public sphere, it encouraged contact between different social movements. For instance, one of those projects called the Direct Action as one of the fine arts. There was a series of workshops organized in 2002, brought together artists, collective, and social movement to examine possible form of connecting political local struggle with artistic practices. Several workshops were organized on topics such as precarious labor, border and migration, gentrification, new media, and emancipatory politics. By the way, the little I've been able to see today of the macro, it seemed to me that there is something which this museum is model that is following. You will tell me if I'm right about that. The MACBA has been a pioneer in promoting a radical alternative to the modern art and postmodern museum. But it's not the only one. And other museums have followed similar patterns. Several of them, I mean, here I'm speaking of the one I know, but as I say, I would like to be able to add the macro, even if I've been told that this experience is going to finish in December, unfortunately. So, for instance, several of them, of the museum, like the Moderna Galleria in Ljubljana with Zdenka Badovinac, the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven with Charles Esche, the Mukwa in Antwerp, Salt in Istanbul, and of course the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofía in Madrid, since Borgabiel moved there. They've joined forces in establishing a network called L'International. At the origin of this project is the conviction shared by the director of those museums that it is necessary to think about art differently and to relinquish the idea that the museum should treat the works of their collection as their own private property. In their view, time has come to substitute the notion of property for that of custody and to assert that what's important is not to own artworks, but to have access to them, even if it's only temporarily. Their belief in the need to develop new institutional models going beyond exclusive ownership prompted them to establish modes of long-term collaboration in order to collectively use their collection and archive. An important objective for L'International is to challenge the dominant narrative in the art world and to build a new plural narrative. With this aim, it proposes collaboration between museums, each with its specific collection and history, so as to instigate a transnational plural cultural narrative. In fact, in L'International, there is a very strong focus on the production of local knowledge. They all insist on the importance for the museum of playing a specific role in the place where they are located and of establishing a critical dialogue with the local culture. The purpose of the new model of museum that they advocate is to create a critical public space capable of bringing about a democratic culture, a culture that will empower citizens. They believe that this can only be done by establishing a dynamic relation with the territory where the museum is located and its particular memory, acknowledging the power relation through which this territory is structured. And this is, according to them, the precondition for creating a relation with the public that will activate their critical capacity. So really to transform the museum in an agonistic space. To envisage the museum in such an agonistic space, it is necessary, of course, to acknowledge that what is at stake in cultural institutions is an hegemonic struggle about the definition of the common sense and the construction of the social imaginary. Museums and public institutions are places where a struggle takes place between conflicting representation of history and the way society should be organized. Instead of being denied on the ground that the public space is the place where one should reach consensus, this conflictual dimension needs to be recognized and activated. In that way, museum will be transformed in real agonistic public space that will facilitate the expression of dissent, thereby helping people to better understand the world in which they are living and allowing them to see things from a different perspective. By providing people with a different kind of experience than the one they find in their role as consumers, museums and cultural institutions can make them aware that aesthetic experience cannot be reduced to the mere act of consuming. They can become space of resistance to the process of commodification of culture brought about by the development of the cultural industries. By fostering a manifold of practices to develop the critical capacities of the citizen, museums and cultural institutions could therefore play a decisive role in the struggle for radicalization of democracy. Thank you.